Welcome to The Synthetic Lens, the podcast where AI voices discuss real research. I'm your host, and before we begin, our standard disclosure. Everything you're hearing is AI-generated audio. The voices are synthetic, but the research we're about to discuss, that's 100% real, drawn from peer-reviewed studies, Harvard research, and verified historical data. Today, we're tackling a question that feels urgently relevant. What actually works when people take to the streets? Joining me is Dr. Maya Torres, a political scientist specializing in civil resistance movements.
Thanks for having me. And I have to say, when most people think about protest and political change, they have it exactly backwards. The data tells a completely different story than what most of us assume.
Well, let's get into it. What's the biggest misconception about protest movements?
That violence is more effective, that armed resistance, revolutions with guns, that's what really changes things. People look at the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and think that's how you overthrow an unjust system. But the data says otherwise.
So what does the data actually show?
Harvard professor Erica Chenoweth and researcher Stephan conducted the most comprehensive study ever done on this question. They analyzed 323 major campaigns from 1900 to 2006, both violent and nonviolent attempts at regime change or territorial liberation. And here's what they found. Nonviolent campaigns succeeded 53% of the time. Violent campaigns, only 26%.
Wait, nonviolent resistance is twice as effective as armed resistance.
Exactly twice as effective. And that's not cherry picking. That's the aggregate of over a century of global data. It held true across different regions, different types of governments, different time periods.
That's genuinely surprising. I think most people would assume the opposite.
Chenoweth herself assumed the opposite. She started this research as a skeptic. She'd spent years studying terrorism and armed revolutions, and she believed in the strategic logic of violence. It took the data to change her mind.
So why does nonviolent resistance work better?
Several reasons, but they all come back to one thing: participation. Nonviolent movements attract, on average, 4 times more participants than violent ones. And that's not a small difference. It's transformative.
Why such a big gap in participation?
Think about it from a practical standpoint. To join an armed resistance, you need to be physically capable of fighting. You might need weapons, training. You're probably risking your life directly. That limits your pool of participants to mostly young, able-bodied people willing to die for the cause.
And nonviolent resistance?
Anyone can march. Anyone can strike. Anyone can boycott. An 80-year-old grandmother can participate. A person in a wheelchair can participate. A parent with young children can participate. You don't need weapons or training. The barrier to entry is radically lower, which means the movement can draw from the entire population.
So it's basically a numbers game?
Partly, but it's more than just raw numbers. Diversity of participation matters enormously. When a movement includes grandmothers and students, doctors and factory workers, veterans and teachers, it becomes much harder for the government to dismiss them as extremists. It becomes much harder to justify a violent crackdown.
Because you can't really call a grandmother a terrorist.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. Chenoweth identified something she calls the 3.5% rule.
Tell me about that.
In every campaign in her dataset that achieved active participation for at least 3.5% of the population, the movement succeeded. Every single one. No exceptions.
3.5% doesn't sound like very much.
It sounds small as a percentage, but think about the absolute numbers. In the United States today, 3.5% would be roughly 11 to 12 million people. That's about 3 times the size of the 2017 Women's March. Imagine 12 million people engaged in sustained nonviolent resistance. Not just one day of marching, but ongoing strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience for months. That's an overwhelming force.
And no violent campaign ever reached that threshold?
Not one. The most successful violent campaigns topped out well below that level. Violence actually caps your participation ceiling because it repels potential supporters and gives the government justification to crack down.
Let's talk about what happens when movements do reach that threshold. Why does 3.5% seem to be the tipping point?
It comes down to what Chenoweth calls loyalty shifts. When you have that many people in the streets engaged in sustained resistance, it affects everyone. Security forces, police, military, they have family members in the movement. They have friends, neighbors. At some point, they're being asked to repress their own community.
And they start to defect?
That's often the decisive moment. In the Philippines in 1986, during the People Power Revolution against Marcos, military units began refusing orders. In Tunisia and Egypt during the Arab Spring, security forces split. Once that happens, the regime's ability to maintain control collapses.
But violent resistance doesn't trigger these defections?
Much less often. When protesters are throwing bombs or shooting at soldiers, those soldiers have every reason to shoot back. It becomes a war. But when protesters are peaceful, when they're clearly unarmed, when the cameras are rolling and the whole world is watching, pulling that trigger becomes much harder psychologically. And if you do pull that trigger, the backlash can be catastrophic for the regime.
Let's talk about some specific examples. What are the clearest cases of this working?
The Philippines is a great example. Ferdinand Marcos had been in power for over 20 years, backed by the military, supported by the United States. He seemed unshakable. But in 1986, millions of Filipinos took to the streets in peaceful protest, nuns kneeling in front of tanks, ordinary citizens forming human chains. When Marcos ordered the military to disperse them, key units refused. Within days, he was gone.
What about South Africa?
That's a fascinating case because it shows the power of economic non-cooperation. The anti-apartheid movement organized a total boycott of white-owned businesses. Black South Africans kept going to work, kept earning tea checks, but stopped buying products from white businesses. After several months, those business owners were in crisis. They started pressuring the apartheid government to negotiate. It created an internal fracture that the movement exploited brilliantly.
The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia?
Another textbook case. In 1989, after decades of communist rule, Czechoslovakians took to the streets in massive peaceful demonstrations. The movement swelled to include hundreds of thousands of people across the country. Within weeks, the communist government had collapsed without a single shot being fired. It was remarkable.
These all sound like success stories against relatively isolated regimes. Does nonviolent resistance work against truly brutal governments?
It can, though it's harder. The key insight is that even the most brutal regimes depend on cooperation, from soldiers, from bureaucrats, from economic elites. If enough of those people stop cooperating, the regime cannot function. The challenge is reaching that threshold before the repression becomes overwhelming.
And sometimes movements fail.
Absolutely. Nonviolent resistance isn't magic. It fails when movements can't sustain participation, when they lack tactical diversity, or crucially, when they abandon discipline and turn to violence themselves.
Wait, you're saying that if a nonviolent movement becomes violent, it becomes less effective?
The data strongly supports that. When movements respond to repression by picking up weapons, they essentially play into the regime's hands. They give the government justification to escalate. They alienate moderate supporters. They narrow their participation base. Many movements that were succeeding nonviolently destroyed themselves by turning to violence.
That's a really important point. So discipline under repression is critical.
It might be the most critical factor. Chenoweth found that how a movement responds when it's attacked often determines its fate. The movements that maintain discipline, that absorb the repression without retaliating violently, often see a surge in support afterward. The regime's brutality backfires.
Because people see peaceful protesters being attacked and they're outraged.
Exactly. That moral clarity is a strategic asset. You lose it the moment you throw a punch.
This is fascinating research, but I have to ask, is this still true today? The world has changed a lot since some of these historical examples.
That's a really important question, and the answer is complicated. In our next episode, we're going to dig into some troubling trends. Since 2010, both violent and nonviolent campaigns have become less effective worldwide. Authoritarian regimes have been learning, adapting, sharing tactics with each other. The playbook that worked in 1986 or 2011 may need serious updating.
So there's a part 2 coming?
There is. Because while the fundamental principles still hold, movements today face challenges that earlier generations didn't. And if we want civil resistance to remain effective, we need to understand what's changed and how to adapt.
We'll pick that up next time. For now, to recap what the research shows, nonviolent resistance succeeds twice as often as violent resistance. Movements that reach 3.5% active participation have never failed. The keys are mass participation, diversity, tactical variety, and discipline under repression. This isn't just moral philosophy, it's strategic reality backed by a century of data.
And all of this research is publicly available. Erica Chenoweth's work, the NAVCO dataset, it's all out there for anyone to verify. That's the beauty of evidence-based analysis.
As always, while these voices are AI-generated, the research is real. Chenoweth's work has been published by Columbia University Press, featured in the Harvard Gazette, covered by the BBC, and cited by movements around the world. Check it yourself. Thanks for listening to The Synthetic Lens.